What if one small act of kindness could change someone's world? Watch this heartwarming story of love, generosity, and a little girl's unforgettable gift to her father. Don't miss the twist that will leave you speechless. The dog wouldn't let anyone near the abandoned car. When the police arrived, they couldn't believe what they saw. The story of the dog's courageous and tearful journey began as the rain fell in relentless torrents. Water splashed against windows and thundered on rooftops, turning the quiet neighborhood road into a fast-moaning river. Distant thunder rumbled through the sky, followed by sharp bursts of lightning that illuminated the darkened suburb. Mick's barking cut through the storm, echoing like a siren. It wasn't an ordinary bark. His voice carried urgency, a deep, steady rhythm rising above the rain and thunder, filled with desperation. Soaked to the bone, the dark-furred dog circled a battered sedan abandoned on the edge of the neighborhood. His bark bounced off the wet pavement, each sound conveying a message that no one could ignore. Curious and concerned, a few neighbors braved the rain, peering out from behind their doors and windows. Jacobs, a wiry man with a guarded posture, stepped outside wearing a worn military jacket. Flashlight in hand, he squinted through the downpour to take in the scene. There was Mick, drenched and wild-eyed, darting between the car and anyone who dared approach. Swinging low, "What's that mutt got to bark about?" someone murmured from their porch. Jacobs shook his head. "Nothing good," he muttered. He recognized the sedan. It had been parked there for weeks, rusting under the indifferent sky. But tonight, the air felt different, almost menacing. Mick's intense bark climbed with every step anyone took toward the car. A crowd began to gather, some with umbrellas, others clutching their coats. They huddled together, whispering nervously. The rain carried a faint metallic scent that clung to the air, mixing with the smell of wet pavement. When a younger man raised a stick toward Mick, Jacob shouted, "Hey, back off!" Mick's growl deepened, his soaked fur clinging tightly to his lean frame. He stood firm, a stone wall of defiance, his muscles coiled and ready to spring. The crowd grew uneasy, whispering about calling animal control or urging the young man to move forward. But Mick's unwavering gaze held them back, its intensity revealing a fire no one dared challenge. Finally, Mrs. Marta, an elderly widow wrapped in an old raincoat, stepped forward. Her calm, firm voice broke the tension. "This dog is not here to harm anyone," she said, her gaze tender as it lingered on Mick's trembling body. Blood matted his head, and his soaked form shook in the relentless rain. "He's protecting something," she added, raising a hand to calm the crowd. A hush fell over the group, broken only by Mick's labored breathing and the relentless downpour. Mrs. Marta pulled out her phone. "It's time we call Clark. He's with the police. He'll know what to do." When the red and blue police lights cut through the rain, the tension deepened. Mick didn't flinch as two officers stepped out of their car. Clark Harris, a tall man seasoned in handling animals, took charge. His steady gaze assessed Mick, who stood firm, his protective posture unwavering. Clark approached slowly, speaking softly. "Easy, buddy. No one's here to hurt you." Mick growled low, his eyes darting between Clark and the car. With every cautious inch Clark moved forward, Mick backed away, his growl softening as though granting permission. "You Sky Park will make you come with us." No. Break. When Clark finally opened the car door, his heart sank. Inside, wrapped in a ragged blanket, lay a tiny, unmoving baby. Pale and fragile, the child seemed lifeless. Clark's training took over as he gently lifted the baby, cradling it against his chest. The other officer quickly radioed for an ambulance. Mick whimpered softly, his eyes glued to the baby as Clark carried the child toward the patrol car. Despite his weariness, the dog limped after them, his determination unwavering. At the hospital, as doctors worked to stabilize the baby, Mick refused to leave, pacing outside the room until allowed inside. Clark curling up beside the baby's bed, Mick lowered his head with a quiet whimper. Exhaustion claimed him, but his loyalty remained unbroken. Nurses whispered about the extraordinary bond between the dog and the child. Mick's devotion, even in his battered state, touched everyone who witnessed it. As dawn broke, Mick barked urgently outside room 207, drawing startled looks from the hospital staff. Clark arrived, calming the anxious dog before stepping into the room. Inside, a young woman lay motionless, her frail body surrounded by tubes and monitors. Mick approached her bed, his movements gentle as he nudged her hand. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Mick, you're here," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with gratitude. Linda's gaze faltered as she murmured, "Let me go alone." She looked away, retreating into the memory of those early days, a stark contrast against the sterile backdrop of the hospital room. We were on the streets for weeks. I was terrified, exhausted. But Mick, he was everything I didn't know I needed. Her voice wavered, breaking slightly before she exhaled, and pressed on. B stood watch all night while I tried to sleep, his ears attuned to every sound, every shadow. He protected us, he protected me, and my son. Clark's heart tightened at her words. He'd seen courage before, but this was different. It wasn't born of duty, but love. A fierce, resilient love. And the rain came, Linda continued softly, her voice weighted with emotion. We were caught in a downpour 2 nights ago. I found this old car on the street, no one around. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Her fingers clenched the hospital blanket, her gaze distant. I had to leave him, my boy. I left him in that car and told Mick to stay with him. I thought I'd be back before he even knew I was gone. Her voice broke. She paused, trembling as she clutched the thin blanket. I walked blocks, soaking wet, searching for help, but my body finally gave out. She looked up at Clark, her eyes brimming with sorrow. I didn't make it back. Instead, I woke up here. Clark's hand tightened on the chair. You did everything you could, he said gently. You've survived more than most can imagine. Linda shook her head, her gaze drifting back to Mick. The dog's eyes met hers, unwavering in their loyalty. It wasn't just me, she whispered. Mick was there every step of the way. He protected us, even when I couldn't. Clark leaned forward, his voice steady. Whatever happens, Linda, Mick and your boy are safe now. I promise they'll stay that way. The sterile hospital air hung heavy as Linda's strength waned. Each breath was a struggle, her body frail. Clark sat quietly nearby, watching the bond between them. Linda's days were numbered, and she knew it. But her son was her reason to fight. When he was brought to her, she cradled him close, breathing in his scent, whispering promises she feared she couldn't keep. One evening she beckoned Clark over. Taking his hand, she whispered, "When I'm gone, will you look after him? And Mick too. Promise me they'll have a home." Mick frowned, breathing hard. Then he opened his eyes wider. Clark's eyes met hers, filled with determination. "I promise, Linda. They'll be safe. They'll have a family," he added in a bewildered tone. She smiled sadly. "Oh, Clark." Relief washed over her, softening her face. In the days that followed, as her strength slipped away, Mick remained by her side, his loyalty unbroken. Clark visited daily, a steady presence, fulfilling the promise he'd made. In her final moments, as her breath grew shallow, Linda opened her eyes one last time. Clark was there, holding her hand, while Mick pressed against her side. A faint smile crossed her lips as she exhaled her last breath, leaving behind the weight of her struggle. Nearly a month had passed since Linda's death. Clark and his wife, Hannah, had completed the adoption process, welcoming Linda's son, Tommy, and Mick into their family. Their home, once quiet, now echoed with the laughter of a child and the steady presence of a loyal dog. Tommy, now a toddler, had brought new life to their home. Mick, ever watchful, stayed close, his loyalty unwavering. The neighborhood, once filled with whispers, had embraced the little family. Neighbors stopped by with gifts, their acceptance a testament to the bond that had formed between Clark, Tommy, and Mick. One evening, as Tommy played with blocks on the carpet, Mick lay nearby, his eyes following the boy's every move. "Tommy's growing up so fast," Hannah said softly. "It feels like just yesterday we brought him home." Clark nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, every day he's finding his place here." "And Mick? He's like Tommy's guardian angel." "Ah," he whispered. "Mark." Anna's gaze softened. "That dog knows loyalty better than most people ever will. It's like he's made it his mission to protect Tommy. As if on cue, Mick lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting Clark's. There was an intelligence in his gaze, a quiet understanding. Later that evening, as Tommy drifted off to sleep, with Mick by his side, Clark sat with Hannah, their hands intertwined. "Sometimes I think Mick's taught me more about love than anything else," Clark murmured. "That kind of loyalty. It's rare." Hannah smiled, her eyes thoughtful. "Love isn't always about big gestures. Sometimes it's just about being there, showing up, day after day." In the quiet of their home, Clark felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They were a family. Imperfect, but bound by love and resilience. Mick's loyalty, Linda's sacrifice, and the hope of a brighter future had woven them together into something unbreakable.